Hello everyone and welcome to the UK Research live discussion session for the AAAS panel, Coastal Ecosystems, the relationship between community and environment. My name is David Souza, I am the organiser of this session and I'll be moderating the live discussion. With us are our panellists, Dr. Andy Large from Newcastle University, Professor Elisa Morguera from Strathclyde University, and Dr. James Cairo from the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Research Centre. Now, unfortunately, our panel respondent, Dr. Sylvia Sabo from Dongguk University in South Korea, is unable to join us today, but she has sent us in some questions and I'll be reading them out on her behalf. So don't worry, panelists, you're not getting off easy. To the audience at home, if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to use the online chat forum and I'll be moderating that on the team's behalf and putting them forward for you. So panelists, feel free to join me on screen and we'll get started. So our first question, which is from Sylvia, whilst the chat gets up and running. Oh, do we have a James? I'm sure he'll join us in a second when he can.
I'm there.
Hi, James. Feel free to activate your camera now. There we go. We can see you now. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Right. Sylvia's first question is going to kickstart us off, and this one is on natural cultural heritage. So she said, natural cultural heritage is an important aspect of sustainable development, yet it often remains neglected. What actions are your project taking to consider preserving natural cultural heritage, and how are these actions being chosen or prioritized? So shall we go around the room, take it one by one, and you can, feel free to chip in and discuss as we go whilst the live Q&A kicks off.
There you go. Thank you so much, David. The question is very relevant. Our project concerns mangrove forest, of whereby we have been trying to monetize mangrove goods and services. By this meaning, we have been the first project to support mangrove conservation through sale of carbon credits. So you can see what we're talking here is we do have the natural services and we also have the cultural value. The benefits we get, 32% of the benefits, that's from the sale of carbon credits, come directly to the community, and that is money the community will prioritize for their local development needs, the needs of water and sanitation, education, and we also have the health. So we give them, so how we prioritize is they have a voice on themselves. We don't choose the project of priority to them. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That's a really good answer. Andy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll step in the sense that I'm the lead up the Living Deltas GCRF hub, and we wrote into our bid to UKRI the very aspect that we would focus in on Delta natural cultural heritage, because we felt that it's in effect the 18th SDG. It's not listed at all, but it's a really important aspect because you can't get true sustainability without really focusing in on natural cultural heritage, because without that you don't get any sustainability or rootedness to your approaches. And in terms of changes in this, I suppose one thing we're working on deltas between Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India. So we have different cultures and different evolutions of deltas across those regions, even though there's quite a degree of connectedness between, for example, the Sundarbans in the GBM Delta, which are shared between India and Bangladesh currently geopolitically, but yet they are an ecosystem in their own right, and a large basis of the livelihoods of the Delta dwellers is commonly held in terms of the connection to the land, and so it's really important to try and get this into policy, and that will also enable, in many ways, if you can do that, a bridge between Delta dwellers and policymakers to get some degree of sort of co-creation within that sort of aspect. Because if you don't do that, then policies won't be sustainable in their own rights, because people just will not necessarily see what's in it for them in that sense. So it's a really important aspect to build in an appreciation of not loss of culture, changing culture over time. I think in terms of how we address sustainable development.
Thank you, Andy. Elisa, same question.
Thank you so much. Now, this is an excellent question. And I think under the One Ocean Hub, what we have found, particularly in the case of our research in South Africa, is that the natural heritage somehow has a bit more protection than cultural heritage. So there's a slight mismatch between the current tools we have to discuss with policymakers and other decision makers about the natural cultural heritage. And these are, for instance, maps to show the areas that are particularly sensitive, to really visualize natural science data. And those maps can be quite persuasive in their own right, but they usually do not include data on the cultural side and the interconnection between natural and cultural heritage. So one of the actions we are exploring is how to overlay the more anthropological and sociological data on culture and see how that overlaps with the natural science data we have, and then use that as one tool of engagement with policymakers. The other area of action is scenario planning. Once again, this is a tool that's really dominated by natural sciences. And so we're trying to find ways in which we can include a more sociological and anthropological data in those exercises, but also opening up scenario planning to non-specialists so that they can become a participatory approach for different stakeholders and directly people that are negatively impacted on the lack of understanding of the natural cultural heritage connections to be part of the debate. The final part that we're looking at is also regulation. And while protection of the ocean is already at a bit of a disadvantage compared to protection of economic interests, particularly those of foreign investors who are more and more interested in blue economy opportunities, what we have realized is that protection of cultural heritage lags behind even environmental protection and protection of the marine environment. And so we're looking at how we need to enhance and connect protection and enhance protection in legislation on natural cultural heritage.
Thank you all, that's great. It's nice to hear that it's such an in-depth part of your research. Sylvia's second question is about the role of women in coastal communities. She's asked, in many coastal communities, women in particular remain highly vulnerable to the impacts of natural hazards. At the same time, women have a critical role in disaster preparedness and recovery. What research is your project undertaking to contribute to women's empowerment within the local regions?
I'll take it. Thank you, David, again for the gender issue. And gender becomes very complicated because whoever hear gender will think about women alone. But even men falls in. So under our national constitution, we do have the 2/3 rule. So the Constitution of Kenya already realized that the women gender were less represented. So that's what we have tried to build it in and promoting the participation of women, whereby in Mikoko Pamoja, which is our showcase project here, that we have it's a project that is run by 2 villages, Magazi and Makongeni. These 2 villages have 7,000 people. But now what we've done, because everybody cannot be in the executive, there's a 13-member committee, 6 of each, 6, they can be 6 men and 7 women, because we do turn the committee every 3 years. So we do recognize that aspect. And you can see, for indeed, we are doing very well than even the national, the grand rule. Thank you.
Should we go in the same order, I suppose? I'll come in next. Yeah, this is very true. I mean, women are at the front line, I suppose, of landscape and climate change. I don't want to put the 2 things together because climate change is the sort of umbrella that's going to really sort of affect the cocktail of other changes occurring on the deltas we're working in. And women are at the forefront of that change, and also at the forefront of receiving the impacts of those changes. In terms of sort of aspects we're looking at, we're looking we take a balanced view between the physical sciences, the social sciences, and the arts and humanities. So we're trying to look back in time to evolution of societal behavior over time. We're looking at household behaviors. We're looking at migration, because women tend to be the people left behind on the deltas, while the men folk go off to other major cities and work, and the women take many of the livelihoods and life-changing decisions for their families on a day-to-day basis. At the same time, women are also underrepresented in the power relations in many of our case study areas. And also, but also at the forefront of commercialization in terms of small businesses, cottage industries, etc. And so it's trying to weave together this bigger tapestry to try and sort of essentially empower women and underrepresented groups in general, youth as well, within our society. Because once you start laying one on top of the other, and then you talk about girls as opposed to women, then you've got another layer of society which is even more marginally representative than others. So we try and take that multifaceted view to looking at the role of women. So, for example, one of our partners is the Vietnamese Women's Museum, which on its own has 13 million members, and so that gives us the potential to reach a swathe of society in Vietnam. It's tougher in the rural areas, it must be said, though. The more remote you go, the harder it is to make those sort of inroads.
Thank you. And on the side of the One Ocean Hub, I think one of our distinguishing approaches across all our research is really to look at the opportunities of connecting international human rights law protection and the protection of the marine environment. And that really helps us to mainstream questions of gender equality across all our research. And it really gives both a systematic approach to several questions that usually undermine gender equality. They may have to do with participation in decision-making, also tenure and the intricacies of land tenure versus tenure of marine resources, question of consent and representation of women's interest in development programs, both the private ones and public ones, and the equitable sharing of benefits with women of decisions that are taken on resources that they have a stake in, as well as whether they have fair access to support. And so what we're trying to do in terms of research is both understanding when recurring to human rights is really a very concrete and specific response to the real life challenges that our colleagues in the natural and social sciences are identifying on the ground as part of their understanding of social and environmental justice around coasts, and also looking in discussions with women representatives how they wish to use legal education and support as a tool for empowerment, and for them to really benefit from the fact that we can clearly identify when their claims are legal entitlements, and how we can work with other actors that have the power to and the obligation to realize those rights to bring about change.
Thanks all. Now, Clarence from the United States has asked a great follow-on question. So I'm going to go a little bit off-piste and change up the order here, because we've just been through and we've discussed the role of women within your research and how that's being considered. And Clarence has asked, does the indigenous knowledge of the local populations and people factor into your resource research and management? So very closely linked, happy to go around in the same order, or for anyone to raise their hand if they're keen. But yeah, great question there from Clarence, and a natural follow-on from Sylvia's.
I'll come in first on that. Absolutely, Clarence. Our hub is based on the foundation that indigenous or locally rooted knowledge is key to sustainable Delta futures. There's so much knowledge that we need to make use of that we've potentially forgotten. One of the aspects that we focus in on our hub is oral histories, trying to make contact with older generations in the deltas to ascertain timelines of change. We're also looking even deeper back, using paleolimnology to try and sort of build up pictures of how these deltas have evolved over hundreds and maybe even thousands of years, to set that greater context and bring this back to the people to get their views upon this. But we're also really keen that indigenous knowledge gets into policy. We're really keen, for example, in India, in the West Bengal Delta, to establish baseline monitoring, for example, there, where there's very little monitoring on the Delta at all in terms of saline intrusion, water quality, etc., just to mention physical attributes of the system. And then to feed that data into the policymakers as early as we can, but then also to share that with the communities. We are engaged in Vietnam with NGOs who are integral parts of our hub, who follow a method called Thai Ban, which originated in Thailand, where this was the views of Ban in Thailand means villager, and it's basically an immersive method of working with communities to build up trust. And once you build up that trust and ask them for their priorities, then you really begin to see what are the key issues in these case study areas, and then you have a basis from which to work. So it's really it's developing that co-creation of viewpoints with local communities is absolutely key. So we've moved over time from the structural measures of the 70s with these big World Bank schemes down to a much more sort of nuanced approach nowadays. And one of our challenges is in how we begin to work with financial actors like UNDP, et cetera, and the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank to actually look at opportunities for relevant, scalable, but yet appropriate schemes that people can buy into and use rather than the big measures from the past. Great question.
Thanks. Elisa, do you want to go next? I see you've raised your hand.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I very much agree with what Andy said. And I think in many ways that is very much the practice also under the One Ocean Hub. Again, coming from the governance perspective, on the one hand, we have now really resounding international recognition of the importance of the role of indigenous and local knowledge for achieving global goals and also very local goals, both from a right to culture perspective and the protection of marine biodiversity that is very clear. And I guess what we're seeing though is on the ground, things may be different. Either national regulations are not in place to really make space and create appropriate and respectful ways to integrate indigenous knowledge in decision-making processes. Some of the tools that I mentioned at the start in terms of natural cultural heritage are not really fit for integrating respectfully and appropriately indigenous and local knowledge. So there's work to be done there. But I think there's also an aspect of understanding prejudice or misunderstandings of what indigenous knowledge is and how it contributes to science, to look at it on the same plane as science. So one thing we're using, again, our colleagues in South Africa are pioneering art-based approaches to convey the richness and the complementarity of indigenous knowledge with modern science, and showing also the tensions in trying to bring all these worldviews together. They've also developed a really incredible animation just to show how we have exact correspondence of our scientific understanding in indigenous cultures and in our own cutting edge modern science, and the opportunities that are there to develop an awareness and an understanding that can then feed into, as Andy was saying, co-creation. And I very much agree with Andy that within the hub, we realize that not all scientists coming from different disciplines are equally prepared to understand and engage with indigenous knowledge holders. I think the social sciences are much more advanced in that sense, and we're relying on them to build the capacity of other researchers. And equally, I think colleagues in the United Nations and our institutions who have so many opportunities to contribute to sustainable development processes, they haven't had necessarily the same exposure to the cutting edge work in social sciences to build their own capacities, with the additional difficulty, of course, of working across scales and what that entails in terms of risks and opportunities for indigenous knowledge holders. So there's, I think, a really interesting, complex, but really fruitful and timely area of research for us to understand how we can support that recognition, what tools we need for it to be effectively part of decisions, and how different actors can then integrate maybe different modalities in their own work, building on those efforts.
Thanks, Elisa. James, do you want to wade in on same question on indigenous?
Yes, I'll wait on the same question. And thank you so much, Karen, and also the response from my colleague. I work so closely with the mangrove forest because that was our basis of our project. And when you look at the mangrove forests themselves, they are what we call marine cultural heritage. All over, if you go all over the world, even those who are working in the Delta, look at what the communities are using mangrove. Like in our region, the mangrove have been traded since BC 200. And when you go, I go to Mozambique, I go to Kenya, I go to Dar es Salaam, or even Western Africa, you can relate mangrove and the people. You even some species, they give their same name, meaning people have grown with this system. And it's very difficult to remove them out of them. So we try so much. If we have to succeed in conservation of this critical ecosystem, it's so critical we integrate the local knowledge. And we do that very well. For instance, the area we had to establish the carbon offset project, we may ensure that the same area is not being used for maybe the salt work activity or for ecotourism activity. You want to bring what's the additionality beyond the day of life. So we value the indigenous knowledge. And this is already also, if you look at the new book coming from the UNESCO World Heritage Site, it's the same message. How do we move on with the people? And even in the UN Decade of the Ocean Science, the issue of cultural is already highlighted. So there are all that fabrics that we need to protect, and our project understand and value the local the knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks, all. That's really good. Had another one through during that discussion. This one's from Kelly, and this one is asking about the advocation of land sovereignty, reparations, and other forms of social restoration. So are you advocating for these forms of social restoration in your work, especially in cases of community relocation? So is community relocation ever a factor that you've come up across in your research? And if so, how have you overcome that? How have you dealt with that? And is it a massive factor?
We haven't, in the Living Deltas Hub, come across examples where communities have been relocated as yet, but we know that communities are already having to move because of relative sea level rise. For example, the Bay of Bengal has among the highest rates of sea level on the planet. And I believe that the figures I've been given by my India colleagues are that up to 1 million people have already had to move because of sea level rise. So, but not because of geopolitics, etc. But we do realize at the same time that we are working in a geopolitically sensitive zone, that there are issues around borders, and there are also issues in some of the states in and around West Bengal where we work, never mind within West Bengal, the current political situation. We haven't so far, and we have to probably all hold our hands up here and say that COVID has affected all of the projects that we're working on just about the time many of us were actually going to begin our fieldwork. We planned a lot of our fieldwork to occur after our second annual meeting in March 2020, and none of that took place. So in the midst of that, we're still waiting to really start our major period of fieldwork. So really in our project, we're concerned with avoiding the tipping points whereby people literally have to move off deltas, because that's going to be much more hard to manage. We need to try and look for resilient strategies that begin to foresee that, and look at, again, going back to indigenous or locally rooted knowledge, looking at the coping mechanisms and the adaptive strategies that are already in existence, maybe have been pushed to the background a little bit to help alleviate some of that. So probably not a direct answer to your question, but as good as I can.
No, absolutely. James, Elisa, anyone want to come in?
Yes, no, happy to come in as well. I think the question of relocation is really a critical one. And in the context of the One Ocean Hub, we have looked or identified different kinds of relocation that raise different research and policy questions. In some cases, we're looking at relocation of dating back to quite some time, to the point that the current understanding is that we don't have coastal or fishing communities anymore in a certain country, even if there were communities there who actually continue to retain cultural connections and some use of the coast. But the time that has passed from their relocation means that the current understanding of their connection is lost. But we also have very current and threatened relocation that can be physical, but it can be also economic and cultural. Sometimes it may be quite gradual and depend on like an approval of a series of different development projects along the coast that eventually erode the possibility for local communities to continue with their ways of life and ways to connect with the ocean. So what we're doing, I don't think we're at a stage of advocating, but I think what we're trying to understand is what are the causes and the different impacts that these instances of relocation are causing and are coming from. And we're trying to map, I think, with the opportunity that the hub provides across the marine, the social sciences, law and arts, different interventions that can allow for I think a fruitful dialogue around why relocation is happening, what it means, what's causing it, and how decisions can be taken differently that really prevent, as Andy was saying, preventing relocation in the first instance, or finding ways to address if it has already happened or happened in part.
David, I'll be very brief. Addition of relocation and how it impacts on the society. I will look again at the functional role of mangrove forest in the shoreline protection and being a major cultural heritage at the coast. So when a major impact occur, and what I'm talking about, this can be both human driven, like when you have mega projects, or when we have the development of ports, and this is happening in my country, or when issues of sea level rise. I've just came from northern Mozambique, where we had a big cyclone. So the first thing the defense mechanism that was given to you by mangrove is lost. So those communities had to move. And they're not moving because they have to, but it's not because they want to, but they have to do, otherwise they have no safety. Then the second thing, what happened is there's just cultural laws. So the question we are now asking is, what is the impact of change, of cultural change, what is the expected cultural change with climate scenario, for instance? And we are seeing this happening, and we start looking what are the adapting mechanisms that people have. Are we creating corridors where also, as much as we are talking about natural corridor for natural environment, what opportunity do we give to the community to adapt to change? And you will never come to one answer, because people lose their way of life, the type of food they were eating, the type of houses they were working on, even the social fabric. So all this becomes very important, and the only way to address it is to look at a bigger picture of the coastal zone management, marine spatial planning, ecosystem-based management, so that we are looking at the land and the sea as one big area that needs understanding the influence of the sea to the land and the influence of the land to the sea. That center is where we are. And so you need to be looking at both the natural capital as well as the social capital. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all. It's really interesting answers, especially having Kelly's question and Clarence's question back to back, and hearing from all of you on how you're balancing both the inclusion and involvement of Indigenous knowledge, but then also the potential need for that knowledge and that community to move or be affected or relocate, in certain scenarios. So really interesting two sides of the same coin there. James, you mentioned about seeing the bigger picture and looking at things holistically, which leads us on nicely to our next question, which is about the Sustainable Development Goals and the SDGs. So this one is all about getting the balance right between the SDGs, and if you're ever in the case of having to prioritize one, how do you do that? For example, Sustainable Development Goal number 1 is about ending poverty, and Sustainable Development Goal number 15 is all about life on land. But if you have a farmer who decides to go into shrimp farming, that negatively impacts the land, but it ends poverty. And it's that balance, and it's that that dance between trying to get things equal that we're interested in here. So the question is, how do you prioritize Sustainable Development Goals and specific Sustainable Development Goal targets? Are you working towards an integrated sustainable development solution, or do you have priorities?
Wow, that's a good one. And we'll go around again. If you look at the mangrove forest, I use it as my domain. It will define it as a multiple use system. It will provide both tangibles and non-tangible benefits. And if you go across the all 17 SDGs, mangrove will directly address almost 15, or even almost everything. Like our project, Bikoko Pamoja, was anchored on SDG 14, for instance, which is the life underwater. And when you, and the assumption is, you knock life underwater, that we're talking about fisheries, you improve biodiversity. When you have good fisheries, you'll be touching SDG number 1, which is poverty. You'll be knocking good health. You become, so you're looking at the relationship between the different SDGs and how they are being addressed by a system like mangrove. And then we look at, if I'm a policymaker, what do I need to address? The poverty alone, or the sustainability and the resilience of the system? And that's the question. So, and this is where the education plays a role. You need to educate, and not only the people you think they don't understand, you also need to educate. So education should be all level, both the local community, then the government, policymaker, and even international community. Look, and when you do that, you'll be able to value the system. And value is not only money. I'm talking about what is the benefit, because most of the people or the community and the society will always be depending on the tangible benefits. And I tell you, I look at the mangrove forest and the value for wood, which is a major cause of degradation across the world. 70% of the community around mangrove in our region here depend on mangrove for wood, as much as there is other alternative. But the question is, the same mangrove, 80% of the commercial fish they feed on come from the same system. So, but the problem is, nobody sees the value of fish unless the fish is on the plate. They don't see the value of the mangrove to fisheries unless they catch the fish. So, but knowledge now, building capacity, building education at all across the level, it brings you understanding. And I like the new thinking, what the government has done. Under the Paris Agreement, we had not included mangrove in a carbon emission reduction under what we call the national determined contribution. But because of able to translate science to policy, it was very easy this year. During the revision of the NDCs, we were able to convince the government, look, mangrove are carbon sinks. They contain so much carbon, but it's hidden on the ground. So if you can include mangrove in your Paris Agreement, it will mean you'll be accelerating your achievement. So it means, therefore, having the forest there and not clearing it for shrimp aquaculture, for instance, you will be addressing climate benefits because of the carbon capture. You'll be addressing food security because of the community benefit. And above all, you'll be supporting biodiversity values and fisheries. And that you can see how we are addressing all the trade-offs. Thank you.
Thank you, James. You've sold me on it. Andy, same question, over to you.
Yeah, very good question. A really interesting one. We don't have a focus SDG in our hub. We had a discussion when we were setting it up with our network of colleagues as to whether we should be looking at Delta SDGs, the ones that looked at deltas, and we came to the conclusion that the SDGs are an indivisible agenda that really can't be pulled apart. And we tried to do a number of things. One is we look at Delta social ecological systems as our main sort of unit of approach. This enables us to sort of focus in on system level dynamics, tipping points, and the nexus between social and ecological systems. The SDG agenda itself have a more explicit normative framework that places value on the well-being of human individuals, I suppose, as well as species and ecosystems. But the SDGs themselves offer no detailed model, I suppose, of how individuals and ecosystems are connected. And so it's here that we try to bring the two approaches of social ecological systems and SDG approaches together. We're also very aware that terms being used in terms of adaptation in our case studies talk about localizing the SDGs, and this is the key approach that we are trying to emphasize as we move on, in that we need to make these relevant to communities in terms of their take up and in terms of what they understand the SDGs to mean. People understand, for example, what nature does for them. If you roll that up in languages of ecosystem services, you probably lose half of your audience straight away. So it's the language you use to try and unpick this agenda for humankind, to really talk about. We all understand about no poverty, etc. But how do we then move into the more nuanced ones about infrastructure, etc.? There's a range of issues. And at the same time, we know that some of our countries that we work with are beginning to look down rather than the 169 targets, that they're talking about 39 targets plus one in Bangladesh. So they're reducing it down to achievable things they can work with in that sense. And finally, in terms of the hub, we're trying to take the Stockholm resilience model. I'm not sure if people have seen this one, but essentially it's four loops. The first bottom one is the sort of biosphere ones, and then we've got society and economy linked into that. And then at the very top are partnerships coming from that. And in the hub, we try and turn it on its head. We try to start at the very base with the partnerships and make them as equitable as we can. This then builds into better societal relationships, less wasteful economies. And if we can start to begin to address that, then the end product will be better biospheres. Rather than beginning to start thinking of ourselves sitting in a biosphere, be it a dirty nest or a clean nest, and how do we deal with that? We try to turn that on its head and begin with the partnerships and make them as equitable as we can.
Thank you. And on my side, on the One Ocean Hub, I mean, I'm very much aligned with what the colleagues have already said. I guess what we're trying to do also in terms of understanding the role of research in understanding trade-offs and the difficult balancing exercises is, first of all, identifying whether there are invisible trade-offs, cases in which actually there are losers, but they're just not even seen, or decision makers are not even aware of them. And going back to the point about gender equality, for instance, women's economies and cultural connections to the ocean often do not figure in those balancing exercises in the first place. Also, the point raised by James earlier around how we make decisions in sectors, and so looking at the sectors in connection and looking at the trade-offs that arise from that more connected understanding of activities that we take on the same environment and same sectors of society. In particular, I think for the One Ocean Hub, there's also a question about understanding connectivity of deeper waters to coastal, understanding how even areas of the oceans that may be completely on the other side of the planet, the ways in which we use those may have very local impacts in potentially distant coastal states. And so understanding those invisible connections from an ecological and social perspective is a first step to make sure that then those balancing processes are fair. The second point is going back to what I was saying about the usefulness of relying on human rights and understanding that not all trade-offs are the same and some trade-offs are just not acceptable. So when we have decisions that may negatively impact basic human rights, right to health, right to food, right to water, rights of women or rights of children, that is a very clear guidance that needs to be integrated across all relevant decision-making about where trade-offs just can't be even looked into. But I think going back to the point that Andy made around fair partnerships, I think there's a potential for human rights to really bring also an understanding of co-benefits, and whereby looking at all these different interests and the invisible ones and the different timescales and impacts of different groups within society, we're also better able to identify solutions that can support multiple sustainable development goals, which are actually meant to be implemented in accordance with human rights. And through a more open discussion and an engagement with those potential tensions, identify solutions that can generate benefit across different SDGs and for different parts of society. And once again, I think relying on arts as a way to have this conversation, not as usual controversial meetings, but spaces where we can all be more open to understanding the different sides to the debate, and this more invisible connections is I think a promising way to make this process is not prioritization, but balancing processes through which we can build and sustain fair partnerships.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you, everybody. It's a fascinating insight into the strategic thinking of your research and your portfolio areas. Now, I can't believe it, but we've only got 3 minutes left. It's absolutely flown by. So maybe we can do one more quick question. Don't feel that you all have to answer, or let's, if so, we'll do 60-second answers so everybody gets a chance. And this one is, what is being done presently to integrate sustainable development goals into the social climate change dimensions, basic needs, environment, and individual needs? So following on from the SDGs that we spoke of earlier, do you know of any integrated dimensions that are helping to amplify or achieve a specific one within your areas?
I can take one. In 1 minute, I'll say, as I indicated, I'm working with a multiple use system like mangrove, and Mikoko Pamoja is working to protect mangrove through sale of carbon credit. We understand the problem of the climate to the global society, and if mangrove can provide a solution, so we are restoring mangrove for the climate benefit, social benefit, and biodiversity conservation. So that hits the triple win, and it's our best example. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Elisa, did you want to go, or Andy?
Thanks. Yeah, just very quickly to say, I think it goes both ways. It's both understanding how society is affected by invisible impacts of climate change on the ocean, and on the other hand, how we build in an ecosystem and human rights-based approach, which really speaks to climate justice, both in adaptation and mitigation approaches.
In probably 20 seconds now, I'll just quickly say that balancing the SDGs with the social ecological system approach, we think is the way forward to try and get this balance between society, individuals, and ecosystems. It offers plenty of ways forward, but it does need that new integrative approach and framework to make that work.
Spot on. Look at that for timing. Thank you all so much. It's been absolutely fascinating, and it's flown by. Thank you all for finding the time and for joining. And I know you can't see it, but we've got a lot of praise in the comments saying what an important session it is and how insightful it's been. So thank you all once again. Thank you as well to the audience at home for your questions. They've been really thought-provoking and really helpful during our live discussion. I hope that we've answered them all to your satisfaction. There we go, another one coming in saying excellent session, well done. So truly congratulations and thank you very much, panelists. And with that, I will sign off, let you all go. And yes, thanks again, everyone.